If you believe you know how power works in America, stay with me. And before you hear another headline rewritten by someone else, hit subscribe now, because this story exposes what happens when fear, authority, and silence collide at midnight, and how one night can unravel an entire system you thought you understood. At exactly 12:07 a.m., when the streetlights on Maple Ridge Court flickered like tired sentries and the neighborhood slept under the illusion that safety was permanent, the raid began with a battering ram slamming into a door that had never been reinforced because its owners believed in laws, routines, and the promise that good people who followed rules would be left alone. And inside that house, Marcus Cole was half awake, already moving before his mind caught up to the noise, trained reflexes rising from a past he had buried under grocery lists, PTA meetings, and whispered bedtime prayers, while his wife Alana reached instinctively for his arm, confusion blooming into fear as red and blue light bled through the curtains, the kind of light that turns walls into accusations. And somewhere outside, boots thundered and voices shouted commands that overlapped, contradicted, and dissolved into chaos. And Marcus knew immediately, too immediately, that this was wrong, that the cadence was sloppy, that the perimeter was uneven, that the urgency didn't match the target. And the realization hit him like cold water. They had the wrong house, but the door was already gone, and the night had decided it didn't care. Alana stepped forward, hands raised, her voice breaking as she shouted that they were unarmed, that there was a child asleep down the hall, that there had to be a mistake. And in that fractured second, shorter than a breath, longer than a lifetime, a trigger was pulled by a man whose name would later be protected by procedure, and the sound cracked the room open, leaving silence behind it like smoke. And Marcus was on his knees before anyone shouted ceasefire, holding Alana as blood darkened her shirt, not in a cinematic spray, but in a slow, terrible spreading that felt impossibly calm, as if the house itself were trying not to panic. The officers froze, adrenaline crashing into uncertainty, radios crackling with confused updates, and somewhere a supervisor demanded to know why the address didn't match the warrant, why the suspect vehicle was registered 2 blocks over, why the informant had gone silent hours earlier, but none of that mattered in the living room where Marcus pressed his hands against his wife's wound with the precision of someone who had saved lives under worse conditions, whispering to her to stay with him, to breathe, to remember the beach in Coronado where he'd proposed, to think of their son's laugh. And even as sirens approached and paramedics rushed in, he felt something else awaken inside him. Not rage. Not yet, but clarity. The kind that comes when illusions finally die. By dawn, the neighborhood was taped off, news vans parked like vultures, and the official statement was already forming carefully shaped phrases about credible threats and officer safety, while Marcus sat in a hospital hallway, hands still stained, listening to a doctor explain that Alana had survived but would never fully recover, that nerve damage would steal sensation from her left side, that trauma had its own long shadow, and that sentence alone felt heavier than any firefight he'd ever endured overseas. It wasn't. Until later that morning, when a quiet man in a suit arrived and spoke Marcus's name with careful respect, that the past resurfaced fully because files had been checked, records quietly flagged, and someone high enough up the chain had realized too late that the man whose door they'd broken was not just a civilian, not just a husband and father, but a former Navy SEAL commander who had led classified operations, trained federal units, and walked away from violence because he believed the war at home was supposed to be over. And suddenly, the tone shifted. Not publicly, not yet, but behind closed doors where apologies are weighed against liability. Marcus said very little in those first days because he understood systems, understood how narratives are built brick by brick, and when the internal investigation predictably cleared the officers involved within weeks, citing policy compliance and perceived threat, something colder replaced his silence. Not vengeance, but resolve. And he began documenting everything. Timelines, inconsistencies, radio logs, the informant who had been paid to lie, the warrant approved without proper verification, the body cam footage that cut out at convenient moments, and the subtle pressure placed on Alana during recovery to move forward for her own mental health. The first twist came when a young journalist, hungry and skeptical, noticed a footnote in a public report referencing Marcus's service record. And when she requested an interview, Marcus didn't give her anger. He gave her facts, and those facts traveled faster than anyone expected, igniting veterans groups, civil rights organizations, and ordinary Americans who recognized the sound of authority closing ranks. The second twist came when an anonymous source leaked audio proving supervisors knew the address was questionable but pushed forward to justify funding metrics tied to high-risk raids, and suddenly the story wasn't just about a mistake. It was about incentives, about fear monetized, about how midnight raids had become routine rather than last resort. Protests followed, peaceful at first, then louder, and Marcus found himself speaking not as a warrior but as a witness, standing beside Alana in a wheelchair. Her presence saying more than any slogan, and when politicians offered scripted sympathy, Marcus declined photo ops, demanding policy changes instead, naming names without raising his voice, which unsettled them far more than shouting ever could. The third twist cut deepest, when Marcus learned that the officer who fired the shot had requested reassignment months earlier due to burnout and had been denied, kept on night raids because experience reduced insurance payouts, and the realization complicated the enemy Marcus thought he'd face, revealing a machine that consumed everyone inside it. Lawsuits came, settlements, whispered, non-disclosure agreements dangled like hush money. But Marcus refused silence, choosing court over comfort, knowing the process would be slow and punishing, knowing retaliation would be subtle and relentless. Years passed, and the case became precedent, changing how warrants were approved in multiple states, forcing body cam reforms, limiting no-knock raids. And though no verdict could restore what was lost, something shifted, because a story that began at midnight refused to stay. Buried, and Marcus, who had once commanded men in darkness, found himself leading in daylight, not through force, but through persistence, while Alana learned to live again, teaching their son that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to confront it. And the final twist, the one no headline could capture, was that the night didn't break Marcus Cole. It revealed him, not as a weapon, but as a mirror, reflecting a nation back to itself, and asking a question that still hangs in the air, long after the sirens fade. If this can happen to someone trained to survive war, what chance does anyone else have? And that is why you should stay subscribed, because stories like this don't end when the cameras leave. They begin.